The morning light that touched the walls of Antioch in October of the year 1097 did not rise gently. It crawled up from the horizon like a thin blade of iron, lighting the dust that hung above the Orontes River, revealing the outlines of a city that had already lived too many lifetimes. For centuries, Antioch had been a crossroads of belief and power, a place where faith marched beside empire, where prophets once walked, and where soldiers now gathered. It was not simply a city of stone, it was a ledger of conquest, a vault where empires wrote their names and lost them again. On that morning, the Crusaders reached its gates. They came not as an army of one people, but as a procession of kingdoms, languages, and private ambitions. Normans from the cold coasts of France, Lorrainers carrying memories of the old Carolingian realm, Provençals hardened by pilgrimage and famine, and priests who believed the dust under their feet belonged to God alone. They looked up at Antioch the way a man looks at judgment. The city rose before them like a fortress of the ancient world, mile-long walls bending across mountain ridges, towers older than many kingdoms, and the citadel perched on Mount Silpius like a stone crown set high above human reach. To take Antioch was to take a legend. To fail was to break the crusade before Jerusalem was even in sight. They were thousands, yet hunger traveled with them more faithfully than any banner. Their armor was not polished. It carried mud from Hungary, dents from battles in Anatolia, and the marks of a march that had killed more than a sword ever could. By the time they arrived, winter was already waiting. Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, Godfrey of Bouillon, Robert of Normandy, leaders of kingdoms that had never met before, standing now in the shadow of walls that had seen imperials, caliphs, and emperors rise and fall. Their unity was fragile. Their purpose was absolute. Behind those walls, the Seljuk governor, Yagi Sian, prepared as a man who had no illusions. He knew Antioch could bleed. He knew its gates had been broken in the past. But he also knew the Crusaders had crossed half the world, driven not by a king nor an empire, but by something more unpredictable. Faith sharpened by desperation. What began that day was not a siege in the simple sense. It was the beginning of a struggle, measured not in days or numbers, but in endurance, and in the quiet erosion of hope. The Crusaders encircled the city as best they could, but Antioch was too vast, too ancient in its design, to be held by a single, unbroken line. There were gaps, open scars of ground where the defenders could ride out, raid, taunt, and retreat. Every night, torches flickered on the walls like stars refusing to die. Every morning, the Crusaders tightened their grip one breath at a time. If a listener were to stand among them during those first weeks, they would hear a soundtrack of the medieval world stripped to its bones. The soft clatter of chainmail, the distant call of a muezzin from within the city, the murmured Latin prayers of starving knights, the sound of iron striking nothing but patience. What the Crusaders did not know, could not know, was that this siege would break them, reshape them, and in the end define them. Antioch was not just a city to be taken. It was a crucible, a place where the crusade would be reborn or buried, a place where loyalty would fracture, where miracles would be claimed, and where betrayal would become indistinguishable from strategy. In the first days, The chronicle writers say the Crusaders believed victory would come swiftly. They looked upon the high towers and imagined God's favor resting on their shoulders. But the walls of Antioch did not move. The gates did not tremble. The defenders did not break. Instead, something else began to break. Time itself. Days folded into each other with the slow, suffocating weight of waiting. The cold grew sharper. Food grew thin. Horses, once symbols of nobility, became rationed meat. Even the strongest knights learned the sound of their stomachs more intimately than the sound of their own prayers. And yet, every night, the Crusaders watched the city from their camps as its lights glowed behind the walls. Behind those walls was shelter. Behind those walls was grain. Behind those walls was the path to Jerusalem. But behind those walls was also an enemy who believed he too was fighting for God. Antioch, in those first weeks, revealed a quiet truth, the kind spoken only in the language of suffering. Wars of faith are not decided by zeal alone. They are decided by the endurance of men who begin to wonder whether God still walks with them. The siege had begun. But the story of Antioch, the story of a city that would fall, rise, and fall again, had not yet revealed its darkest turn. The Crusaders believed they had come to conquer a city. But Antioch would first conquer them. The walls of Antioch were not merely stone. They were memory. For centuries, empires had risen and collapsed around them. But the walls endured. Romans built them. Byzantines restored them. Arab dynasties guarded them. And now, in the winter of 1097, the Crusaders stood before them, cold, starving, exhausted, and unprepared for what those walls would demand. Antioch stretched wide across the Orontes River Valley, its ramparts running like a spine of iron through mountains and plains. 400 towers, dozens of gates, a city that could swallow an entire army and still have room for another. Yet the Crusaders looked at it and believed God had placed it there for them. But belief, as they were about to learn, does not break stone. When the Crusader host encircled the city, they attempted what every chronicler would later describe as a siege without enough men to siege or food to survive. They had no navy to block supply routes along the river, no siege towers to challenge the battlements, no engines heavy enough to crack open the walls. What they had was faith, and a hope that faith alone could pressure the city into submission. But hope cannot be eaten. And so, as days turned to weeks, and weeks into bitter months, starvation marched into the Crusader camps with the discipline of an army and the cruelty of an old, familiar god. Horses disappeared first, then oxen, then leather. Some men boiled grass, others chewed roots or ground bone to powder to stretch their rations. Those whose faith had once burned bright now whispered prayers not for victory, but for survival. And every night, the walls of Antioch stood silent, watching. Inside Antioch, Governor Yagi understood his advantage. He was experienced, cunning, and unburdened by illusions of divine protection. His soldiers conducted sudden sorties, swift strikes that cut down Crusader foragers and burned their supply lines. To the Crusaders, each scream from the surrounding fields was a reminder. Antioch was alive, and it could lash out whenever it wished. Winter rains turned the Crusader camp into a grave-soaked bog. Armor rusted, tents collapsed, Disease bloomed in the mud like wild rot. And yet, no banner fell. Not one leader suggested retreat. Because retreat meant abandoning the cross, and abandoning the cross meant abandoning themselves. While the walls of Antioch held firm, something else began to fracture. The unity of the Crusader army. Bohemond of Taranto, cunning and ambitious, saw an opportunity. If he could be the one to take Antioch, to break a city that had resisted empires, he could claim it as his own principality. But Godfrey, Raymond, and the other lords knew this ambition. And in the shadows of their tents, arguments sparked like flint on stone. Was this a holy war, or a war of personal kingdoms disguised as holy? The siege demanded unity. Yet ambition kept carving fault lines between the knights who had sworn to fight as one. And above them, watching from the battlements, Yagi Sian smiled. A divided enemy is a defeated enemy. Then came the moment every Crusader chronicle tried to disguise with pious wording. Some men broke, not from fear, but from hunger. A small contingent of knights abandoned the camp under cover of darkness, fleeing into the wilderness with whatever scrap of food they could carry. When word spread, morale collapsed. If knights, men sworn by oaths, had fled, what hope did common soldiers have? The leaders acted fast. Godfrey punished the deserters. Raymond tried to restore morale. Bohemond whispered promises of Antioch's wealth if they simply held on. But punishment did not feed an empty stomach, and promises did not warm frozen fingers. The Crusader army had not yet lost the siege, but they had lost something far more dangerous: their belief that victory was inevitable. As the Crusaders weakened, Antioch's walls seemed to grow taller. The city felt invincible, eternal. But every city, no matter how holy or ancient, hides a weakness. And in Antioch, that weakness was a man, a guard on one of the towers, a man who did not believe his leaders would survive, and who feared the future more than the Crusaders outside. His name would be whispered in chronicles with both hatred and awe. Firuz, a man whose decision would determine the fate of a city older than some kingdoms, and decide whether this siege would be remembered as a miracle or a betrayal. And as whispers of secret negotiation began to drift through Bohemond's tent, the Crusaders realized something profound. If God would not open Antioch for them, a man might. They gathered on the plains outside Antioch like two storms born from two different horizons, but destined to collide on the same strip of earth. One wore crosses, the other crescents, but both carried men who bled the same color and prayed for the same thing: survival. At the start of winter 1097, the Crusaders expected resistance. They did not expect a mosaic of armies converging upon them. For Antioch was no isolated fortress. It was the key to the Syrian corridor, and every power who watched that corridor had something to lose. Inside the walls, Yagi Sian commanded a force smaller than legend suggests, not tens of thousands, but a determined core of Turks, Armenians loyal to him, local militias, and seasoned archers who knew every parapet as if the stones carried their names. He could not defeat the Crusaders in open battle, so he used what remained to him: height, fear, and the belief that time was on his side. From the towers, his archers loosed volleys that fell like black rain. The Crusaders, unused to the accuracy of Turkish composite bows, found themselves pinned each time they attempted a frontal push. And yet, behind those walls, the defenders were afraid. Not because the Crusaders were stronger, but because they realized something quietly dreadful. The Crusaders had come this far. They would not turn back. When word reached Aleppo that the Franks had set their camps around the ancient walls of Antioch, Ridwan reacted not as a strategist, but as a ruler who understood symbolism. If Antioch fell, the door to his own domains would stand open. He marched swiftly with cavalry, hoping to strike early before the Crusader lines hardened. His men glittered with color, green, red, gold, their armor shaped by centuries of Syrian craft, their horses restless with bred endurance. Yet Ridwan expected to meet a tired force struggling at the foot of an impregnable city. What he found instead was something altogether different. An army starving, diseased, exhausted, but unbroken. The clash was sharp and sudden. The open field became a ring of screaming hooves and dust that swallowed the afternoon sun. Ridwan's cavalry circled, probed, and fired. The hallmark of Turkish warfare. But the Crusaders formed tight infantry walls, their shields locking with an almost Roman discipline rarely displayed in the chaos of medieval Europe. Neither side won, neither side broke. Instead, Ridwan withdrew, shocked to discover that weakness did not always mean defeat. And Antioch continued to stand. Between these armies, between the camps and walls, something spread more quietly than arrows or rumors. Crusader horses died so rapidly that knights were forced to fight on foot, shattering the identity they carried from Europe. Men scraped roots from frozen soil. Others boiled leather straps, hoping the broth carried something to sustain them. Some even ate the corpses of pack animals whose names they once called with affection. Inside the city, the situation mirrored the suffering outside. Yagi Siyan rationed grain. Families hid food from one another. Mothers diluted meals with hot water until the bowls were nothing more than the memory of nourishment. Two armies, two causes, but a single shared enemy. The slow death that comes silently when the winter does not end. Early spring arrived with the sound of hooves again, this time from Damascus. Dukak came reluctantly, pressured by politics, by honor, and by the unavoidable truth that if Antioch fell, Damascus would stand next in line to meet the storm. His forces met the Crusaders at Harim, across the Orontes River. The battle was fierce, but short. Dukak's assault faltered, the Crusaders counterattacked, and once again, a relieving army retreated before it could make a meaningful dent. 3 armies had tried, 3 armies had failed. And with each retreat, a realization began to seep not into the Crusader minds, but into their bones. Perhaps God really was with them. For medieval men, belief is not an ornament, it is fuel. It turns exhaustion into endurance, fear into fanatic courage, and hopeless sieges into divine missions. By the start of May 1098, the Crusaders' numbers were reduced, their wounds festering, their supplies nearly gone. But for the first time, the defenders of Antioch saw something new. Hesitation. Men on the walls began to whisper that help might not arrive again, that Ridwan and Dukak had already tried and already failed. Panic travels differently in fortified cities. It does not break the gates. It slips into sleeping chambers, into kitchens, into the thoughts of commanders when they stare too long at the horizon and see no banners returning. Inside Antioch, distrust grew like a second shadow. Christian minorities inside the walls faced suspicion. Armenians, Greeks, and Syriac Christians were accused of plotting to open the gates to their European brethren. Punishments were swift and often unjust. It was this atmosphere, this mixture of fear and rumor, that gave birth to the betrayal that would break Antioch open from the inside. And when the gate finally opened, it would not be the Crusaders' swords that made the greatest wound, but the hands of someone who lived behind those walls. The siege was about to turn, not by strength, not by numbers, but by the oldest force in every war, the quiet ambition of a single man seeking to survive the end of his world. The winter over Antioch did not arrive like a season. It arrived like a sentence, a quiet, unspoken verdict, passed upon tens of thousands of men who had marched across continents believing that faith alone could sustain them. As December settled over the Orontes Valley, the Crusader host discovered a truth older than any scripture. Armies do not starve suddenly. They starve slowly, precisely, without mercy. The fields around the city had been stripped bare months earlier. The livestock was gone, eaten, stolen, or lost in skirmishes. The supply lines from the coast were choked by Turkish raiders who struck like smoke and vanished like dust. And within the Crusader camp, where the banners of Christendom once rose like a forest of conviction, now hung banners that did not move at all. Because there was no wind, because even the air seemed exhausted, those who had arrived with armor polished to a mirror sheen now wrapped themselves in whatever they could find. Coarse wool, torn linen, scraps of old sails brought from the Mediterranean. Their horses, once the pride of noble bloodlines, stood skeletal, their ribs like the frame of a ruined cathedral. Chroniclers wrote of men boiling leather straps to soften them into a tasteless soup. They wrote of knights cutting open their last pack animals with prayers on their lips. And they wrote of something even darker, that hunger had slowly erased the differences between lord and footman, between noble and common, between those who commanded and those who obeyed. When famine strikes, hierarchy is the first casualty. But starvation alone does not define a siege. Isolation does. Across the river, on the ridgelines beyond the Crusader trenches, the Turkish garrison inside Antioch watched the suffering below them and understood something crucial. The Crusader army was beginning to fracture from within. Deserters slipped away under moonless nights, leaving behind only dents in the frost where they once slept. Some attempted to flee south toward the Armenian foothills. Others tried to reach the sea. Many never arrived. Yet for every man who disappeared into the cold darkness, others endured, held here by faith, by pride, or by the belief that turning back would be a kind of death no less bitter than starvation. Among them were the Normans of Bohemond, the Provençals of Raymond of Toulouse, the Lotharingians of Godfrey, and the knights sworn to Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy. They came with different tongues, different ambitions, different banners. And during the siege, each banner carried its own shadow, because hunger does not just weaken bodies, it weakens alliances. Arguments over rations became arguments over leadership. Arguments over leadership became arguments over God's will. And arguments over God's will during a crusade were not arguments at all. They were the seeds of schism. Bohemond of Taranto saw this before anyone else. He knew that Antioch was more than a city. It was a prize, a fortress dominating the route into Syria, a gateway to the deeper territories of Islam, a place from which trade, tribute, and power could flow. And he also knew something that few dared say aloud. Whoever controlled Antioch would shape the next chapter of the crusade. So as famine devoured the camp, Bohemond began tightening an invisible net, a network of promises, negotiations, and whispered pacts with those who feared the Provençal nobles might claim the glory of the siege. Ambition is rarely loud. During a siege, it is barely a breath. But while internal rivalries scaled quietly, external danger grew unmistakably. Because the Crusaders were not the only ones starving. Inside Antioch, the Seljuk garrison had begun rationing grain and meat. Their stores were deep, but not endless. Their water reserves were guarded, but shrinking. And their commanders, Yagi Siyan and his son Shams al-Dawla, understood that they were not fighting a single enemy, but an entire world that had marched to their walls. Yet they held firm. Turkish archers lined the battlements, their silhouettes black against the pale sky. Oil cauldrons were kept warm. Stones were arranged in perfect rows. Even the muezzin's call, echoing over the ramparts, seemed stronger when the Crusader camp was weakest. Thus, the winter of 1097 became a season of two starving armies, staring at one another across walls, older than both. Outside the walls, the men of the cross endured hunger so numbing that prayers became little more than whispers shaped by cracked lips. Inside, the men of the Crescent held their city like a clenched fist, waiting for relief to arrive from Aleppo, Mosul, or Damascus. Neither knew which would break first. Neither understood how thin the line was between collapse and survival, and no one, not even the commanders studying their maps by candlelight, could see the storm gathering beyond the mountains. A storm that would arrive not as famine, nor as enemy soldiers, but as something far more devastating. A counter-siege, a noose tightening around both armies, a trap in which Antioch would become not a fortress, but a tomb. And when that trap finally closed, the city that had endured hunger, ambition, division, and winter would enter the darkest chapter of its ancient history. The chapter in which Antioch fell, rose, and fell again. The winter inside Antioch did not break, but something else did. Not the walls, not the armies. A fracture appeared instead in the minds of men. A thin line between desperation and revelation, between the hunger of the body and the hunger of the soul. For months, the Crusaders had endured the unendurable. Rotting grain, slaughtered horses, leather boiled into soup, and a sky that refused to offer even the dignity of clear weather. Every attempt to break out failed. Every envoy returning from the coast brought the same message. No reinforcements. Not yet. Perhaps never. By June 1098, many knew a truth they dared not speak. The crusade might die here, on the stony ground of Antioch, not by sword, not by flame, but by the quiet erosion of hope. And then, In the moment when faith hovered at the edge of extinction, a voice rose from obscurity. His name was Peter Bartholomew, a poor, untrained, unremarkable Provençal follower with no authority, no lineage, and no reason for anyone to believe him. Yet he claimed he had seen a vision, not merely a dream, not the delirium of starvation, but a visitation from St. Andrew himself. The message was simple and impossibly grand. Beneath the soil of Antioch, buried beneath the broken stones of the Cathedral of St. Peter, lies the Holy Lance, the very spear that pierced the side of Christ. To touch it would be to hold the wound of God. To possess it would be to command His favor in battle. Most commanders dismissed the claim. Bohemond suspected ambition. Raymond of Toulouse suspected manipulation. Adhemar, the spiritual leader, suspected a lie. Or worse, a madness born of famine. But disbelief is a luxury only the well-fed can afford, and the Crusaders were starving. So, on the night of June 14th, a group of exhausted, hollow-eyed soldiers followed Peter Bartholomew into the shattered cathedral, carrying shovels, picks, and torches whose flames flickered like trembling faith. They dug, hour after hour. The floor gave way to rubble. The rubble gave way to soil. The soil gave way to nothing. Silence spread. A cold, heavy silence filling the broken chamber, like a second darkness. Then Peter Bartholomew stepped forward, climbed into the pit, and began to dig with his bare hands. What happened next would divide chroniclers, split armies, and seed doubt for generations. Some swore the earth gave way, and a long iron spearhead emerged from the soil, its metal darkened by centuries, its weight unmistakable. Others whispered that a hidden spear had been placed there earlier, buried by men rather than by history. But in that moment, doubts meant nothing. What mattered was this: the Crusaders believed. They believed because they needed to. Because the walls outside promised death. Because the armies of Kerbogha tightened the noose day by day. Because no army, however brave, can survive without meaning. And the Holy Lance became meaning incarnate. It passed from hand to hand, soldier to soldier, a relic warmed by trembling palms, a proof that suffering was sacred, that endurance was holy, that God had not abandoned the starving city or the men trapped within it. A surge spread through the Crusader ranks, not of food, not of weapons, but of a force far more dangerous: conviction. Soon the commanders would have no choice but to act on that conviction, to gamble everything, their lives, their armies, their entire crusade, on a breakout charge against a force that outnumbered them 5-1. But that moment had not yet come. For now, the crusade possessed something it had not held in months: the belief that victory was still possible, and belief in the hands of starving men can be sharper than any sword. The winter of 1098 did not loosen its grip. It deepened. The Crusaders held Antioch. But what they possessed was not a city. It was an open tomb. The kitchens were empty. The horses were bones. The men who survived the siege now faced a punishment older than any sword: starvation. Outside the southern walls, Kerbogha of Mosul, commander of 40,000, drew his camps into a tightening ring. No food went in, No hope came out. The Crusaders, who had once marched as an army, were now a collection of shadows clinging to the stones of a city they barely controlled. Inside, morale fell faster than the temperature. Some knights abandoned their posts. Others slipped into the night and rode west, whispering that God had forsaken them. For the first time since the march began, the holy war felt less like destiny and more like a mistake. And then, as happens so often in the memory of faith, something unexpected surfaced from the cracks of hopelessness. It began with a man named Peter Bartholomew, a poor Provençal cleric, unknown, unimportant, almost invisible among the nobility who led the crusade. But he carried a dream. A vision, he claimed, sent from St. Andrew himself. In the dream, the apostle pointed toward the ruins beneath the city's ancient church. Buried there, Peter insisted, was the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side on the cross, a relic of immeasurable power, a sign, a promise, a weapon not of iron, but of belief. The leaders hesitated. Bishop Adhemar doubted it. Bohemond ignored it. To them, it smelled like desperation, disguised as revelation. But the soldiers, the starving, the trembling, the exhausted, heard something else in the cleric's words. Permission to hope, and hope, in a city dying by the hour, was more valuable than any supply ship. So on the night of June 14th, 1098, torches gathered beneath the ruined church of St. Peter. The air was suffocating, hot, wet, packed with bodies and the smell of old dust. Peter Bartholomew descended first, clutching his vision like a man drowning clutching a plank. Hours passed. Sweat rolled from faces lit only by flame. Shovels scraped stone, voices whispered. Some mocked the search, some prayed for it. Some simply dug because digging meant not thinking about the hunger. And then it happened. A shout, a tremor. A blade-shaped fragment of metal, buried in darkness for centuries, rose from the soil, wrapped in cloth, black with time, but a shape unmistakable. It did not matter that many doubted it. It did not matter that some suspected it had been planted. For the soldiers of the First Crusade, the men encircled, cornered, gasping for salvation, it became, in that instant, exactly what they needed it to be: a miracle, a weapon of God, a declaration that heaven had not abandoned them after all. When the lance was carried through the streets, men wept openly. When it touched their hands, they swore they felt warmth radiate from the metal. The city, only a day earlier a graveyard of the living, shifted, slightly, but undeniably, because faith is most powerful not when it is proven, but when it feels impossible. Kerbogha still waited outside the walls with the largest army the Crusade had ever faced. The Crusaders still had no food, no reinforcements, no advantage except one: they believed again. And belief, in a war fought in God's name, was sometimes sharper than the sword. Dawn over Antioch no longer brought warmth or clarity. By June 1098, it brought only the same three things: smoke, silence, and the smell of men starving. Raymond of Toulouse wrote of days when no man could tell which was thinner, our patience or our bones. Chroniclers described Crusaders boiling grass, chewing leather straps, even digging among corpses for scraps. Antioch, once an impregnable prize, had become a stone coffin, with its captors locked inside, because now the tables had turned. The Crusaders who had besieged this city for 8 months were themselves the ones besieged. From the east, Kerbogha of Mosul, veteran warlord, master tactician, commander of a coalition of Muslim forces numbering 35,000, 40,000 men, had arrived to reclaim Antioch, but he did not attack immediately. Kerbogha knew patience could be sharper than any blade. He tightened the noose around the city and waited for the Christians to starve. And they did. The Crusaders had only 2 choices left: break out or wither into dust. Inside the walls, commanders gathered in cold chambers, lit by torches that flickered like dying hope. Bohemond urged a breakout. He insisted that Antioch would not fall to force, but to fear. The fear Kerbogha hoped would do his work for him. Raymond of Toulouse resisted. He did not trust Bohemond's ambitions. He suspected the Norman wanted control of the city for himself, and viewed every suggestion of attack as a political ploy. For days the commanders argued. For days the men starved. Then comes the moment all chroniclers mark as the turning of the tide. Whether by faith, desperation, or the strange alchemy of both. On June 14th, a Provençal visionary named Peter Bartholomew declared that God had revealed to him the location of the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side at the crucifixion. He said it lay buried beneath the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter, beneath the very ground they were standing on. Skepticism spread quickly. Some knights mocked him. Others, crippled by hunger and doubt, clung to anything that resembled deliverance. So they dug, all night, all morning, through earth, stone, clay, and silence. And then, a single rusted iron spearhead was lifted from the dirt. Bohemond accepted it immediately. Raymond hesitated. The knights fell to their knees. The starving soldiers wept. Faith, in that moment, became a weapon sharper than any forged in iron. Whether the spear was Christ's or not did not matter. What mattered was that the men believed. Belief can turn a dying army into a rising one. Belief can ignite men whose bodies should no longer stand. Belief can reverse the tide of a siege, not by the force of steel, but by the force of meaning. By that night, the atmosphere inside Antioch had changed. From despair to a trembling, dangerous hope. Bohemond seized the moment. He gathered the commanders and declared, "Tomorrow we march out, not as prisoners of hunger, but as soldiers of God." And so, the Christians prepared to do what no starving army should ever dare: open the gates and charge the enemy who waited to watch them die. For the first time in weeks, the night inside Antioch was not silent. The soldiers prayed, sharpened blades, whispered to their dead, and tied worn pieces of cloth around their arms so they could recognize one another in the chaos to come. Outside the walls, Kerbogha's campfires burned like a necklace of stars encircling the doomed city. He had no idea that the men behind those walls, thin, trembling, broken, would walk out the next morning with a fury of resurrection in their eyes. And when dawn came, the Crusaders marched, not as a defeated army, not as starving ghosts, but as a faith reborn, carrying a spearhead pulled from the earth and a certainty pulled from the edge of death. Antioch, a city that had already fallen once, was about to witness the battle that would decide whether it would rise or fall again. For months, the Crusaders had been the besiegers. And then, suddenly, they were the besieged, trapped inside the very city they had conquered, surrounded by the vast army of Kerbogha of Mosul. What followed was not a story of glorious battle formations or triumphant charges. It was a story of whispers, of fear, and of betrayal. Inside the walls, famine carved its name into every street. Men who had marched from Europe full of zeal now lay skeletal, their faith tested not by swords, but by hunger. Some boiled leather, some ate grass, some simply closed their eyes and waited for God to decide. But in every dying city, there is always someone who chooses survival over salvation. His name was Raimbert, a minor knight from northern France. He was not famous. He did not command battalions. History barely remembers his face. But the chronicles remember one thing. He tried to flee. No speeches, no loyalty, no vows, only the oldest instinct of man, to run. He slipped out of the city under darkness, past corpses stiff against the walls, past sleeping guards who no longer had the strength to remain awake. But fate did not give him a clean escape. Turkish scouts found him at dawn, and when they dragged him before Kerbogha, the once proud knight broke like thin glass. He offered the only currency left to a desperate man. He offered secrets, the weaknesses of Antioch, the fractures in Crusader unity, the names of leaders losing morale, the chaos inside the walls. His betrayal was not a single act. It was a chain reaction. One coward granting the enemy clarity. Kerbogha, calculating and cold, listened. What he heard convinced him of something momentous. Antioch would fall from within before it fell from without. And so he tightened the noose. No mercy, no negotiation, no time for the Crusaders to breathe. The siege of the city became a siege of the soul. Faith, exhaustion, starvation, and fear caught in a tightening circle. But what Kerbogha did not know was that betrayal cuts both ways, and deep inside Antioch, another whisper was rising. Not of treachery, but of a relic that would change everything. It began with a vision, or perhaps with desperation disguised as a miracle. On June 14th, 1098, a Provençal peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed that the Apostle Andrew had appeared to him in a dream. The message was simple, almost absurd. The Holy Lance, the very spear that pierced the side of Christ, lay buried beneath the floor of St. Peter's Church in Antioch, a relic of unimaginable power, a sign, a promise. The Crusaders, half mad with hunger and surrounded by death, clung to the vision like drowning men grasping for wood. Raymond of Toulouse ordered the dig. Hours passed. Sweat mingled with dust. Prayers tangled with doubt. Men collapsed from exhaustion. And then, at the bottom of the pit, Peter Bartholomew cried out. He held something long, dark and rusted. Was it really the Holy Lance? Or just an old spearhead from some forgotten garrison? The chroniclers disagreed. The skeptics whispered. But none of it mattered. The Crusaders believed. And belief, in a city dying by the hour, was more dangerous than any sword. a wave of fervor swept through the starving army. Men who had lost hope found it again. Men who could barely stand now claimed they felt the fire of God in their bones. Bohemond, ever the tactician, saw the truth. Whether the lance was holy or not, its effect was real. Faith became fuel, and fuel became resolve. And resolve became something Kerbogha did not expect, a city that was supposed to fall, preparing to strike. The Crusaders, outnumbered and weakened, decided on something unthinkable. They would not die in Antioch. They would not surrender. They would not starve. They would march out, assemble in formation, and attack the greatest army they had ever faced. Not because they had strength, but because, for the first time in months, they believed God was marching with them. The next dawn would not simply decide the fate of Antioch, it would decide the fate of the First Crusade. And so, under a sky heavy with dust and divine expectation, the gates began to open. The smoke over Antioch did not lift quickly. It lingered, thick, gray, almost unwilling to let the sun reclaim the sky. For the men who had survived the siege, the air tasted of metal, ash, and something quieter. Something that felt like the weight of unanswered prayers. Antioch, once the gateway of the East, now stood as a monument to contradiction. A Christian army had taken a Christian city from Muslim rulers, only to lose it again, and then reclaim it, not through strategy or discipline, but through a desperate, almost miraculous surge of conviction. A victory born from the edge of collapse. But victory did not bring peace. When the Crusaders finally secured the walls, they did not celebrate. They simply collapsed where they stood. Knights leaned against shattered towers. Archers dropped onto broken tiles. Monks knelt in the rubble, whispering promises to a God they believed had intervened. Yet beyond those whispers lay a truth no chronicler could fully hide. Antioch did not fall once. It fell twice. It fell to hunger. It fell to betrayal. It fell to illusion and to faith. And it would fall many more times, long after these men turned to dust. Bohemond, the Norman warlord who had fought on the front lines, refused to relinquish the city. To him, Antioch was not a waypoint on the road to Jerusalem. It was the prize, a seat of power, a throne carved from blood and rubble. He claimed it for himself, invoking a loophole from the Crusaders' oath. To keep any city taken by treachery, the rule said. And Antioch, through the act of Firuz's betrayal, fit neatly into that clause. Some knights protested. Others were too weak to argue. Some simply stared at him with hollow eyes, wondering how a sacred war had come to look so much like ordinary ambition. It was at this moment that the crusade quietly fractured. Not enough to break, just enough to show the first hairline cracks. Faith had bound them through the desert. Empire would now pull them apart. Outside the walls, the bodies of Kerbogha's coalition lay scattered across the plain. His army, once the largest force in Syria, had dissolved under fear and disunity. Turkish emirs blamed one another. Arab soldiers fled to their tribes. The Seljuks withdrew to the north, and Kerbogha himself rode east in silence, his reputation broken, his authority gutted. He had failed not because he lacked strength, but because his coalition lacked loyalty. The Crusaders had survived a siege that should have killed them. Kerbogha had lost a battle he should have won. History rarely cares for fairness. In Antioch streets, the survivors walked like ghosts. Market stalls had collapsed under looting and fire. Churches bore arrows in their doors. The Orontes River carried the dead downstream, out of the gates and out of memory. Everywhere, the city whispered fragments of the past. Latin prayers, Greek echoes, Arabic laments. Antioch had always been a crossroads of civilizations. But now, it felt more like a place where civilizations came to bleed. This was the cost of holy war. Not the banners, not the triumphs, but the silence afterward. The silence that asked, "What have we truly won?" Months later, as the Crusaders prepared to march toward Jerusalem, one chronicler returned to the northern wall, the place where so many had died. He wrote only one line. Here, faith was sharpened by suffering, and empire tried to swallow it whole. It was as close to an answer as any man could give, because Antioch had not been a victory of swords, nor a failure of strategy. It had been something far more human, a siege where hope starved, a city that refused to stay loyal to either side, a battlefield where faith and ambition collided, and neither emerged unscathed. And so the Crusaders moved south, limping toward Jerusalem, their armor dented, their ranks thinned, their faith strangely heavier. Antioch remained behind them, smoldering, divided, coveted, a symbol of what happens when men fight for God, but cannot escape the pull of empire. And in that ruin, one truth settled like dust across the stones. No city in the Crusades fell as often, rose as violently, or cost as much of the human soul as Antioch. The siege was over, but the story it carved into history would never heal.